Welcome everyone to Agile Talks by Agile Gurus. I'm your host Rahul Kataria, and today we have our Agile coach Awais Sheikh.
Hey, Rahul.
Good, Awais. Next question we have is anti-patterns. So
Mhm.
Awais, I know you have been involved lately with a lot of new teams and old teams, and you have seen a lot of anti-patterns. So I'm gonna let you talk about that um, for story points.
Yeah. One of the biggest anti-pattern that we had been talking about is, always thinking in terms of hours and converting that to story points. So we already covered how to kind of mitigate that, right? The next one is I've seen a lot of teams coming in and pointing story points, pointing bugs. So they're like, okay, we have this bug in the backlog, we need to point it.
Yeah.
Now, one of the most important aspect is bug is coming out of a story or a feature that you're working on, and the estimation should be to have it end to end complete. So whenever you see story points being associated to bugs, that's a big red flag for me as a coach. And the moment we see that, we understand that's an opportunity for the team to coach on that. What is your definition of done, uh, and what are we really working towards. Another thing that we have seen is story pointing the unfinished issues, like again and again, right?
Yeah.
As stories flow from one sprint to another, they're like, okay, let's re-estimate it. It was a 5 point story, we could not complete it. Let's put it 8 at this point of time.
Yeah.
Or sometimes even worse. I've seen some POs that, okay, this was an 8 point story, and the team has done good amount of work in the last sprint. Now let's bring it in this sprint, but only 1 point effort is left. So they'll like rechange the estimates into 1 point and kind of go from there.
Yeah.
I think the anti-pattern over here is then we kind of lose the metrics when we have to do over the period of time. What is the cycle time? What is the lead time? What is the throughput of the team? All of those get impacted. So, for that reason, like the suggestion would be have the same story points, and while you're building capacity for the team for that sprint, you need to consider things within the capacity.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Do you want to add anything, Rahul?
No, I mean, I think you covered most of it. But yeah, like that's a very good point. And I think
Mhm.
in the last podcast, we talked about
Mhm.
making sure your team has a definition of done and a
Yeah.
definition of ready. Both are
Mhm.
super important. A lot of times you'll just pick up stories which are really not ready, and then you just keep working on it. And then you'll see the pattern there. That one story is flowing from sprints to sprints to sprint.
Mhm.
Another good point of as you mentioned is, when people move or team move stories from one sprint to another, it was an 8 pointer and now it's only so much work left. They just start calling it 1 pointer, which is like, again, a big anti-pattern, guys.
Yeah.
If you didn't complete it, let's move all the points to the next sprint, because the goal again is not to just get points for the team. Goal is
Mhm.
to learn from it. Maybe in your retro, talk about what happened. Why couldn't we complete that story? Was it actually an 8 pointer, or could we have broken it down into smaller chunks? Right. One of a very successful team I remember I worked in Capital One with. What they got to a point was all their stories were less than a 5. They anytime they got a story which was an 8, they would figure out a really good way to vertically slice it and make it either like into 3 and 5s, like 2 stories, or like whatever, multiple bunch of stories from that. And then that way they had like a really good flow going, without just overloading the sprint. And I know I'm talking too much, but one other thing I guess I have seen for teams doing is they have a capacity of
Mhm.
whatever 100%, and they load up the whole sprint with
Mhm.
more than 100% of the work, just because they're either their product owner or their leadership said, well, 5 other things are also important, so let's just pull
Mhm.
them. So I guess a very key role here for a scrum master is to look for those kind of patterns where the teams are just overcommitting, and stop them from doing that. Even if you think it's more important, you cannot pack a suitcase with 10 extra thing when there's really no space, just for the sake of calling it, more stories. I guess same point from Yaya in the chat, but the 2 days will go into hours. So I guess Yaya, you were probably talking about when I mentioned for the new teams, you start with having 2 days as one point, etc. It's just like a frame of reference to start for the new teams because they don't have any benchmark. But once you get to a mature level, once you do a few sprints, you'll figure out, you'll get an idea of what you want to call as a team, what you want to call a 3 point or a 5 point story, and go from there. I'm reading through the questions as I go. Who can challenge the story points in sprint planning backlog grooming sessions? So the whole team can
The whole thing,
challenge.
yeah.
I definitely I have seen that product owners try to chime in into story points. I'm not a big fan of that. I try to keep product owners away from that. Even a scrum master, people who are actually doing the work are the
Exactly.
people who are supposed to challenge the story points and talk about story points and agree to what it is. And I'll give you a very good example. In one of my previous teams, a manager uh, who all this team reports to, they called him a delivery lead for in that organization, and he would come to the grooming every now and then a team would try to say, this is a 5 point story, it's going to take this much work, and this is et cetera, et cetera. And he would try to undermine them and say, it just felt like he's telling them, you guys didn't know how to do your job and this should be a 3 pointer. So that's a big anti-pattern, guys. Like, keep those
Yeah.
people away from the grooming meeting as much as you can.
And there's
um,
another pattern usually that hey, this developer would be working on, so, and we all have those backmans in the team that, okay, this guy is working on it, so for him it's a 1 point story. If the other team members work on it, it's probably a 3 point or a 5 point story. But again, in terms of how it should really happen within a team is the person who is doing, uh, who's the Batman over here, who claims that, okay, if he does it, it can be done in 1 point. He needs to explain it to the entire team. What are the differences? How he can make it a 1 point story, right? If it still
exactly.
cannot be done, make sure you pair program with another member so that that knowledge base is spread across the team,
Yeah.
rather than you know teams working, individuals working in silo within a team. Let that knowledge spread out within the team and understand why it is a 1 point versus 3 point. And most of the times the PO or the scrum master will say, okay, let's break it somewhere in the middle, let's have a 2 point for it, and this guy will work on it. But the goal is any member of the team should be able to pick up that story, and it should be similar size story for each and every member of
Absolutely.
And I was just add to that, one of the anti-patterns I have seen, especially when implementing stories, is the fact that, people tend to estimate at the task level. But when you're looking at the story points, think about the story itself as the effort of all the combinations of tasks, and then you estimate. So if it's going to basically take us 1 day for us to test the story, for us to write the code, for us to do the unit testing, and then for us to push it into production, that is our definition of done, because that's our goal sprint that we want to get it live. Then you estimate all those efforts into that one story. So anti-patterns that I've also seen is also when you have people wearing two hats, half a scrum master, half a developer. And so
it.
he's not
Oh yeah.
sure where
Yeah.
basically his allegiances lie, so he wants to be part of the scrum master saying this, but at the same time he's wearing the hat of a developer, or he is actually the product owner but at the same time a developer. And then he's coming to say, well, I actually think it's 3 story points, but it's actually, remember the Agile principle, respect for people and processes, and then also remember the SAFe principle, respect the house of lean is also respect for people and culture. So let everyone have a voice, and then that's where we have conversations. If I always told me it's a 3, why? If you told me it's a 13, why? The fact that you may be seeing it as a 13 could just be because you're factoring in the fact that we need to set up test data, tear down test data, and do all the other things. Whereas the other person just thought about it in isolation of my own effort of what I need to do. But remember,
Absolutely.
it's a story, not a
It's
task
not a
you're
task.
estimating.
That's right. And Daniel, you just reminded me of another great anti-pattern and something to look out for. If you're grooming a story, And I don't know how you guys groom, but you know, in some teams they use cards. Some people just use hands to story
Yeah.
points. But if you're doing that, and let's say everyone says it's a 5, doesn't really mean everyone understood what the story is. So don't just move on saying it's a 5, let's move on, but let's have a good conversation about why do you guys think it's a 5? Because some people would be thinking of some rare case scenario where no one else would have thought about. And that grooming is probably a really good point to talk about those scenarios. Now, I have seen stories starting from everyone said it was a 5 and becoming 8 or a 3 because of the conversations that happened after the fact.
And time boxes story points, just enough
Oh,
info in a grooming session. And an anti-pattern is people delve into so many conversations that estimating one story takes almost the whole 2 days that I would have actually used to implement the story.
That's right. That's right. But I mean, especially for the new teams, it is going to take a while to adapt to it. I keep saying that because new teams get really frustrated saying, we are spending so much time on learning how to story points. Why not just do ours? And then they just give up on the whole concept of it. But yeah. So I guess, guys, that's it for today. We don't have any more questions, but we have a part 3 next week, the same time. In the part 3, we're going to be discussing about, the anti-patterns, more about stories moving between sprints, and more into grooming and re-estimating and slicing stories. So if you guys have more questions for that topic, feel free to send it my way at rk@myagilegurus.com. And then we'll see you guys next week. Thank you, guys.